Let me get to this evening's presentation. Since we've had a great 2 days, we want to cap it off tonight with a wonderful session that we have planned for you. It is the General Raymond E. Mason Distinguished Lecture on World War II. I would say in the way of a little historical footnote that the speakers for the Mason Lecture previously have included noted writers, historians, and other distinguished members of the armed forces and journalists, and it is made possible through the generosity of the late Major General Raymond E. Mason and his widow and the Raymond E. Mason Foundation. General Mason served in the European theater under General Patton in the 4th Armored Division, and was a great supporter of education and understanding the lessons and the significance of World War II. Our first Mason lecture was by a very dear friend of this museum, and he is the one who recommended tonight's speaker. And that's our friend and newsman and journalist, Tom Brokaw. About a year ago, when we were planning this conference, I called up Tom and I told him that we'd like to have somebody to talk about films and documentaries, especially the first year of World War II, to help understand how those films shaped America's memory of the war. Who could speak to the creation of those films, the directors, and how they were made and what they meant. And so we talked a little bit, and he says, "I've got the perfect guy for you, Nick Clooney." And I said, "Bingo. That sounds perfect." And then I called him up and talked to Nick, and he said, "I had 3 uncles in World War II, and I'll do anything for those guys." And my son George is named after my uncle George, who was a B-17 pilot. And I said, "You're perfect, Nick." I said, "We'd be honored to have you come here to serve as our speaker for the closing night of this banquet and this conference." So you all know Nick Clooney as a reporter himself, anchor, managing editor, news director in places such as Lexington, Cincinnati, Salt Lake City, Buffalo, and Los Angeles. And he's published 3 books, including The Movies That Changed Us, which was published in 2002. And it was his intellectual curiosity that drove him as a reporter to explore other areas of interest, and he hosted talk shows in Cincinnati and Columbus and music programs on the radio. And for 5 years, he was both a writer and on-air spokesman for a show that I think many people in this room have seen and know about, the American movie classic cable channel. He's accumulated many, many awards, Emmys for commentary, and 3 Emmy nominations for his work on the American movie classics. Nick is married to the lovely Nina Warren, with whom I've had the pleasure of speaking to over dinner. They're both from Perryville, Kentucky. She's also a writer and TV host in her own right, and an inventor, I've heard. Their oldest child, Ada, followed her parents' footsteps and is also a writer, so you all are having a good influence on your children. Most importantly, she's the mother of Nick and Nina's only grandchildren, Allison and Nick. The Clooney's younger child, George, is an Oscar-winning actor that everybody in this room, I'm sure, is familiar with. Is a producer and a writer and a director. And Nick told me that George is named after his uncle George, the B-17 pilot. So there's another personal connection to what we're talking about tonight. I would also like to make a note to say that in April of 2006, Nick and his son George went to the Sudan and to Chad in Africa. Some of you probably know this because it was publicized, to report on the ongoing genocide in the region of Darfur. And since their return, both of them have traveled extensively as advocates for a peaceful solution to that crisis. And that's an amazing commitment, and I think we all applaud you for that. Together with your son, you are preaching a very valuable lesson, reaching back to World War II and that is that good men and women must step forward if we're to prevent genocide and these kinds of atrocities that come upon us. Ladies and gentlemen, here to close out the 2011 conference, World War II, please welcome Nick Clooney, The Movies That Changed Us, and afterwards Don Miller will join him. All right, thank you. It's all yours.
Thank you. My Lord. After that, the least I can do is go ahead and die. It's the greatest eulogy I've ever heard. It just seems it was such a generous accolade, series of them actually. But let's be straightforward with one another. The truth of the matter is, I have only one distinction. And that is, I am the only person, even in this distinguished assemblage, I am the only person who knows precisely, word for word, what his obituary will read. It will read Nick Clooney, comma, brother of famous singing icon and movie star Rosemary Clooney, comma, father of Oscar-winning actor, producer, writer George Clooney, comma, died today, period. It's been a remarkable, I don't know, you have caused me a lot of trouble, all of you. I have been worried about this speech for actually months, really worried for weeks. I have been trying and sweating and working over the premise. How do I actually approach this? How can I compress it? How can I make it interesting? I don't know why I bothered, because it's not going to matter. Everybody in this room has made speeches, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. As a matter of fact, this is one of the few occasions you'll come to an event where those in the audience completely outshine anybody on the stage. No question about it. But you've been. You have done exactly the same thing I have done. You sweated over it. You tried to get the words just right. You know that if you can get that combination of phrases together, in a flash of light, you will change people's lives. Of course, you never do. By the time you get out of the building, you'll try to remember what my name is. The important thing that's happening here has nothing to do with what I'm saying or the fact that I am here. Look around for the importance. Look around at these people. Look around at that youngster at the table just behind me. That's the important thing that's going on here. It's an amazing fact that I don't remember, I don't think I remember any speech that I have ever heard in person. Some of the ones on television, but not in person. I've thought about that. There is one. Back I was very young, and I went to hear a graduation speech at Millersburg Military Institute in Millersburg, Kentucky. It was a May day. It was almost 90 degrees. We were sitting outside. I had a cousin who was graduating. The speaker did not show up. The commandant of the cadets went after consultation, went to the local physician and asked if he would fill in at the last moment. It was a moment he had waited for all of his life. He stood up, and for 50 minutes, in 90-degree heat, while we were on the little tin chairs on the lawn, he spoke for 50 minutes about the virtue of roughage in the diet. I have never forgotten that speech. This one will not be as memorable. What a week, what a week, what a half a week here. What a week. It's absolutely amazing, the people that are here, the experts, the interesting people, the veterans, the ones who have been. I can't imagine. I doubt, seriously, if the time between December 7th, 1941 and August 7th, 1942 has been as thoroughly vetted ever as in these last few days here in New Orleans. It's amazing. Of course, there's an urgency to it. For decades, many of us in this room have been begging for all of our institutions to make greater efforts to squeeze dry this priceless and vanishing resource of World War II veterans. Their memories, what they thought about it then, what they think about it now. That resource, very nearly spent, isn't it? Very nearly. There's something new. Soon we will lament the loss of not just every American who served, but every American who has World War II in his or her living memory, even people such as I. 7 years old on Pearl Harbor Day. Each moment of it, however, etched into my memory forever. As you've heard, my uncles, William, 24 years old, George, just 20, had taken me to see a double feature at the Ritz Theater in Cincinnati. When we went into that anonymous darkness of the movie house just after church, we were at peace. When we came out, nearly 5 hours later, we were at war. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew it was a big deal. My two uncles took me to the Rexall drugstore across the street, and they were talking very seriously, and they were so distracted they bought me a huge 25-cent Hershey bar with almonds. Such a thing had never happened in our family history, as far as I knew. This war was looking pretty good so far, from my point of view. Yeah, I was to learn a lot more about it in the next few years, and what I learned would mark me indelibly for the rest of my days. Or sometimes quick to say that an event changed everything. As a reporter, I have said it myself when caught with my microphone in the midst of an important benchmark, as it seems to overwhelm us, and I'd say, "This changes everything." Well, no, it didn't. No, it didn't. But it is clear now that December 7th, 1941 really did change everything, and not just for us. The sudden addition of the United States of America to the fragile balance of power between those contending nations at that moment actually did change everything for everyone, right up to this morning's headlines and as far ahead as fallible humankind can see. My uncles, William and George, changed the world that day because they decided right then they were all in, right up to their necks. And everybody we knew made that same commitment. For my uncles, their first investment might have been that 25-cent Hershey bar to keep me quiet. But they were ready for whatever next investment would be required. I remember so well them shaking hands. I had never seen them do that before, right there on the corner in that Sunday twilight. And they walked me home. And then they walked all of us into another world. And here we are in another December twilight, making sure that we never say goodbye to all those young men and women now gone, are walking among us disguised as old men and old women. We must never say goodbye to them or what they were, what they became. I've been assessed the duty of checking on the popular culture from December 1941 to August 1942 and its effect on the war and vice versa. What were we singing about? What was on the radio? What were we reading? What movies did we pay to see? What did that say about us? Well, in the months that led up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, I can tell you pretty clearly what we didn't want to listen to or watch, with a few exceptions. We didn't want to hear about the war that was raging in Europe and Asia. The big movies were Arsenic and Old Lace, a comedy about murder. The Man Who Came to Dinner, a comedy about a beard. And Citizen Kane, a comedy about nothing. A lot of our popular songs looked inward, not outward, brand new, just starting that fall. The stars at night are big and bright. I knew I'd get you. Why didn't you know that, young man? Good heavens. I like New York in June. How about you? And in my Adobe Hacienda. Okay, now what was the #1 record on December 7th, 1941?
Chattanooga Choo-Choo.
Exactly. Chattanooga Choo-Choo. You were the conductor, weren't you? Right you are. To be fair, there had been a smattering of Hollywood movies raising warning flags about the fascist menace to the democracies, particularly the menace posed by Nazi Germany. Notably, in 1940, for instance, there had been Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, pretty good movie. And preeminently, Charlie Chaplin's brave and funny send-up of the bad guys, the great dictator. But there were very few of them, and seen from a later point of view, they were pretty tame. You know, what we must remember is that movies were and are a business. Germany and Italy were lucrative markets. Gone with the Wind had done a very brisk trade in Europe. War or no war, business is business. On the other hand, in the business of books and the new kid on the block, radio, the Nazis were not treated so gently in the United States. The runaway bestseller was Berlin Diary, a tough slap in the face to wartime Germany by reporter William L. Shirer. And radio reporters, especially Edward R. Murrow of CBS, were making history of their own. Murrow's somber clarion call, "This is London," while the Blitz rained down on helpless civilians, was beginning to shift the ground under isolationist America, but just beginning. Just beginning. Shouldn't overstate that. Gallup poll 1 week before Pearl Harbor found 80% of Americans opposed to entering the war in any active way. Though this was interesting, that same poll said a majority in this country hoped the Allies would win the war. What Allies? Who was left? Wait a minute, what did we have? The battered and tattered remnants of British and Commonwealth troops? The impoverished emigres from defeated European nations, huddled in London bomb shelters? The Soviets, as we heard at our table, though they were doing remarkable work, many were still streaming eastward in defeat. Some allies. Thank you very much. Who knew that the people who comprised the allies on December 7th, 1941 would not be needed to turn the tide in the war? No, the Axis would do that themselves, wouldn't they? In what must be considered the most monumentally stupid miscalculation in the long march of stupid human history, Japan attacked the United States of America. They didn't have to. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States of America. They didn't have to. But those two acts sealed the fates of Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. Within 44 months, just 44 months, they would be consigned to the garbage dump of history. And pop culture, Music, books, radio, and above all, movies would play a role in their downfall just as they had played a role in their rise. Clearly, we all of us had badly underestimated the Japanese capacity to make war. They turned out to be very good at it, didn't they? The avalanche of disasters piled up, some in just a few days. Hong Kong gone, Guam, its pitiful force of 500 Marines, half of them armed, gone. Philippines invaded, Malaya invaded. Buried in all of this, and we've had this explained so well, I have to do the Reader's Digest version, but there have been wonderful expositions of this the last several days. Wake Island, tiny dot on the map of the Pacific, showed some important signs of life. Wake Island. Boy, Gertrude Stein would have had a field day. There was no there. It was a stop for the civilian Clipper aircraft on their way to Hawaii in the United States, but it had strategic military value. Congress authorized some things, including 6 5-inch guns, 500 Marines, 100 support people. And Marine Major James Devereaux made extraordinarily good use of them. He had to. There were 1,000 civilians he was trying to protect. At the same time, the construction workers. Pearl Harbor Day, Wake was hit. On December 11th, the Japanese came to take the island, as they had taken other islands and other very strong positions in their triumphant march through the Pacific. And they were ready this time, too. They had 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, a couple of patrol boats, 2 transports crowded with thousands of Japanese Marines. Facing them, 600 American military. But Devereaux and the Marines were ready, too. They took the bombardment in silence. They waited till the last moment. They turned loose with their guns. The cruiser, one of them, the flagship, was hit 3 times, limped away. Destroyer was hit, blew up, sank. 2 more destroyers hit by the guns. So was another cruiser and 1 of the 2 transports. Even the diminished squadron of flying Wildcats had a victory, dropping 100-pound bombs. They hit the depth charges on the deck of a remaining destroyer, and it blew up and sank. An astounding military achievement. In less than an hour, a couple of 100 Marines had driven off a powerful invasion force and sent it back to the island base from which they had come. The Marines in that encounter lost 1 man. It had never happened to the Japanese before. In this country, we had no idea how deep the shock was, apparently, within their military establishment. But in Hollywood, they knew a good story when it slapped them in the face, and they got to work on it right away. Of course, the Japanese came back 12 days later. There was the inevitable result. The Marines gave a good account of themselves on the little atoll before submitting to the nightmares they would encounter after the battle. The movie was actually in the works before the end of that year, amazingly. And before the end of the year, they had a surprisingly quick turnaround, released in 1942, very successful, well done, except for the usual fabricated Hollywood backstory hokum. The battle sequences were based on actual December 11th communications. They had to tack on their own December 23rd ending because they didn't know how it had ended. The actors were Brian Donlevy, Walter Abel, Robert Preston, and William Bendix, and future TV stars Hugh Beaumont, the dad in Leave It to Beaver, of course, and Alan Hale Jr., who would take his own epic 3-hour tour, not to Wake Island, but, of course, Gilligan's Island. They were in the cast. Also born in this movie was a phrase that would become famous for the rest of the war and beyond. There was the grizzled veteran who would talk to the nervous young recruit when the enemy was about to attack for the last time. What did they say?
Praise the Lord and pass the answer.
That was coming up. That does come up.
I was praying.
That's all right, Tommy. There's nothing wrong with praying here. There are no atheists in foxholes.
There you go. No atheists in foxholes. That, let me see, how was it? How many? My count. That quote showed up in 4 other World War II movies and an even dozen radio dramas. It even hung around for a Korean War film 9 years later in 1951. Pretty good. Incidentally, while American war histories make Wake Island just a footnote about larger events, there were several Japanese historians who gave it much greater significance. I interviewed one not long ago. He is a historian. He went on as far to say, in some ways, the command didn't recover from that humiliation. He felt that there were echoes of it in the plans for the invasion of Midway. Interesting. On the other hand, America's Tin Pan Alley had a full head of steam from day one. As it was on the attack, as soon as the bombs fell in Hawaii, the first published war song I could find after Pearl Harbor was, "We did it before, and you darn right we can." That's right. And we will do it again. Yes. Then, the first, that took care of that. Actually written, published, recorded, and released before Christmas, 1941. Boy, they were anxious for that one to be a hit, and it was. Right behind it was the song, based on the phrase attributed to a chaplain while the planes were still attacking that Sunday morning. Praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord. Okay, all right. You know it. Pop culture was in high gear even before factories retooled from civilian to military production. On the radio, newscasts took on new importance. A series called This Is War, written by famous authors, was broadcast on all 4 networks simultaneously. But there was still time for Duffy's Tavern, where the elite meet to eat, and Inner Sanctum, where the famous squeaking door was not quite as scary as it had been before December 7th. Not when American kids were getting pushed down the Philippine island of Luzon, past the capital of Manila, someplace called Bataan Peninsula. Starting to look as if this story would not end well, but the movies tackled it anyway, even while the battle raged. They wouldn't finish the film till long after the battle was over and became a tragic chapter in American history, worst military defeat to that moment. There had been enough bungling to go around. On the home front, we were singing about Rosie the Riveter. The discouraged troops in the malarial jungles of Luzon had their own song, and I know there are some in here who know this one too. We're the battling bastards of Bataan. No mommy, no daddy, no Uncle Sam. March 11th, General MacArthur and his family left the Philippines. General Jonathan Skinny Wainwright was left behind. He was about to get a lot skinnier. The departure was not received well by many of the troops. While they waited their fate and fought on, big movie back home, just out in previews, was Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring Jimmy Cagney. In another part of the world, the U.S. troops were landing in Northern Ireland to begin training for some vaguely defined European operations. And the big hit song that they were singing is, "This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private rooms or telephones. This is the Army." Sure was. The movie Bataan did not come out until 1943, and it didn't attempt to show the big picture. It told the story of one polyglot unit at a bridge on the road south. Robert Taylor starred in that movie. Interesting man. This was his last film before joining the Navy as a flight instructor. But there was something unusual in the casting. This unit had to be ragtag. It could not be a regular U.S. Army formation, or we would never have seen this little cinematic moment.
Any action out there?
I ain't seen nothing. I ain't heard nothing. But you can bet they're out there, thick and fleas on a hound dog in Georgia.
What's the matter, Sarge? You in a hurry? I can wait.
Sergeant, thought I might relieve Epps here while he gets his chow. That is, if it's okay with you.
Oh, thank you, Lieutenant, but I don't feel hungry just now. But Matowski over yonder, he's always ready to eat.
I'll send Matowski in.
Thanks, Lieutenant.
That actor was Kenneth Spencer. He only made 2 other movies. he would not have been at that machine gun in a regular Army unit. African American, all units were strictly segregated. The filmmakers knew that, of course, but in the movies, at least, there were small baby steps toward a different America. In the real world, on April 9th, 1942, American and Philippine troops surrendered on Bataan. Word began to leak out about terrible treatment of our prisoners of war. Another Axis mistake, as it turned out. Cold and uncompromising resolve crystallized in Americans. All of us just kids doing the scrap metal, scrap paper. All of us. I took my grandma's only 4 flat irons. That was not a good choice either. While that was going on, another harbinger of things to come was developing on the high seas. I must say that we have in our midst these marvelous raiders of Tokyo. They gave one of the greatest presentations any of us has ever seen when they talked about their great adventure. Unbelievable. Absolutely amazing, amazing. I would wish, however, that while they were very hard on the enemy and absolutely, eventually, irresistible to the rest of us, I do wish they would stop hitting on my wife. Gentlemen, please. Tom Griffin, worse than anybody. Known Tom for a long time. Cincinnati boy. He's amazing. There they were. Anyway. The land of the rising sun, we had been told, had never tasted defeat. 4 months before, it had sown the wind of war. And now it would experience the first tiny zephyr of the avenging whirlwind it would eventually reap. It was April 17th in the States, April 18th aboard the carrier Hornet. 16 B-20, you know all about this, B-25s flew off the deck to attack Tokyo. What a moment. And other Japanese cities. The raiders were led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, portrayed in the movie by Spencer Tracy.
Hello, York. Doolittle. York, I want you to get 24 B-25s with volunteer crews down to Eglin Field as soon as you can. The job will take them out of the country for about 3 months. Tell them it's a secret mission. They won't know where they're going until they get there. That's right, volunteers. Tell them they're not to talk to anybody. That's an order.
What an adventure, and what a moment for the United States of America and those 80 young men and all of their families, what all of that meant to us. There is a little side story that I would like to tell you, because I bet you there are some in this room that do not know it. I can tell you because Tom Griffin has met this gentleman I'm talking about. There was a prologue to 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. That, incidentally, was not really the first time a twin-engine B-25 flew off the deck of a carrier. We all believed, the raiders themselves all believed that to be the case, that they were told that. But they weren't. Months earlier, 3 other crews practiced in Florida and elsewhere. They did more than 100 short field takeoffs. In the last days of January, the carrier Hornet docked not in the Pacific, but at Norfolk, Virginia. Eventually, 2 B-25s were lifted onto her deck. The third plane had engine trouble. Each plane carried a pilot and co-pilot only, but each carried enough sandbags to simulate gross weight loaded 30,000 pounds. Plane 1, piloted by Captain Jack Fitzgerald, a former test pilot. Plane 2, piloted by Lieutenant Oscar Wirtz. His co-pilot was my friend, Lieutenant Tommy Klein of Augusta, Kentucky, longtime neighbor of mine. On February 2nd, Groundhog Day, 57 days after Pearl Harbor, both B-25s revved up to maximum RPMs. The Hornet had already been turned into the wind by Skipper Mark Mitcher, was at 28 knots. In a heart-stopping moment, those two bombers rolled off the deck and were airborne. It worked. Tommy later told me it took 183 feet for his plane to lift off the deck. He measured it. The two crews were not invited to join all of these great adventurers in the Pacific. They thought, probably for security reasons, the colonel did not want his pilots or anybody else to know the destination and the details until they were well out at sea, and they were isolated for 2 months. It takes nothing, of course, from the incredible glory of the 80 brave men who struck the first blow at the heart of Japan to let everyone know that there was a 30 seconds over Norfolk just before there was a 30 seconds over Tokyo. 19 days after the Doolittle raid, General Wainwright on Corregidor surrendered the remaining American troops in the Philippines. If the tide was turning, it was well hidden from the battling bastards of Bataan. But turning it was. We all knew it at home. Kay Kaiser's band told it. There'd be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. No bluebirds over the little island of Midway, Japan's next target. Early June, Battle of Midway came up so suddenly, took place over so wide an area, and was so erroneously reported at home, we didn't get a handle on it at all until months after it was over. No songs about it, no movies either, until John Ford's documentary a half a year later. It was only then we learned what a sea change the Navy had wrought. Seems to me that defeats are often obvious almost immediately. Some victories only become apparent with time. That was true not just at Midway, true in the Atlantic as well. Our victories in those early days, few, not nearly so visible as our defeats. The U-boat was transcendent in the North Atlantic, and nowhere yet would it be possible to mount a second front. Our air power would take training and logistics before becoming a factor over Europe. Such nuanced progress does not lend itself to pop songs that were rousing or movie heroics that would come, but not before August, which is the parameter I've been given. We had to be content with melancholy songs, pretty, but they were melancholy. When the lights go on again all over the world, and we'll meet again, and you'd be so nice to come home to. Yes. The movies? Okay, the big ones. One, In Which We Served. Very good war movie. The other, Jack Benny's To Be or Not to Be. That went well. 86 movies were made about the war in 1942. 11 had been made about the war in 1941. All that was about to change. Europe had had her Berlin Diary. The South Pacific was about to have Dick Tregaskis's The Guadalcanal Diary.
Headquarters, 5th Regiment, 1st Marine Division, Fleet Marine Force, 26 July 1942. From Colonel Wallace E. Grayson, USMC, to all members of this command. Subject mission of this force. The coming action marks the first offensive in a war against the enemy involving ground forces of the United States. The Marines have been selected to initiate this action.
Ain't it always the way?
Which will...
I thought that Bill Bendix was on Wake Island, and I was pretty sure that Lloyd Nolan was in Bataan. I don't know how they pulled that off. Nothing like laying out the premise of the movie in pure military gobbledygook. There it was, the first major ground action by the U.S. against a World War II enemy, and as my uncles would have said, we were all in. Ground, air, sea. We at home had no idea what a close-run thing it all was. We didn't know how outnumbered our troops were at first, or how efficient the Japanese Navy was. In a way, the loss of the Sullivan brothers on the cruiser Juno off Guadalcanal was a wake-up call. A triumph was not inevitable, after all. Over the dinner table, at the neighborhood tavern, and in the quiet moments just before we went to sleep, we thought about all 5 brothers, the whole family, wiped out in a wink of time. Perhaps it was then that we started to get it. We might win this thing. Check that. We would win this thing, but it was going to take some kids doing a whole lot of dying before we did. And tragically, that's what happened. Other nations lost more, much more. But 400,000 is not an insignificant number. It may fall lightly off the tongue, but not so lightly when counted one at a time. One 20-year-old kid who was as old as he was ever going to be. One at a time. So when I was going through all these movies, I got to one called Stage Door Canteen. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. You're thinking about the song. I left my heart at the Stage Door Canteen. Good song, but it wasn't in this movie. Instead, this was a parade of stars, mostly Broadway stars of the 1940s, including Gypsy Rose Lee, with a fairly lame story thrown in to hold it together. What caught my ear, however, was a song I had never heard before, or at least I didn't remember. It's a good song, a poignant wartime story. The boy and the girl are parting. She said goodbye. He stopped her. It was then that I realized that books and movies and songs can become casualties too, just like people. They might go off to war, do their bit, and then never come back. A song no longer familiar, a singer no longer remembered.
Oh, don't you know the memories we gathered can never, never die. We mustn't say goodbye.
I suppose that's when I had my Damascus moment. I suddenly understood my message for you, the reason I came here, the reason I would dare to speak to an audience like this, an audience so full of memories. That is, that it's running outside the door. It is going beyond this place to many other places. My message for you, we mustn't say goodbye. Not to each other, not to them. We mustn't say goodbye to all the Uncle Georges and bombers over Europe, and Uncle Williams sweating in New Guinea. Not ever. Not even when they are gone. Because if we do, we are saying goodbye to a big part of ourselves, of what makes us Americans, what makes us to strive to be better as they did. We mustn't say goodbye. And I think that's all I had to say to you. Oh, no. Eat plenty of roughage. I think Dr. Don is supposed to join us up here now. And is that right, Professor? Please join us right up here, if you would. Thank you. Now here's an economic lesson. Here's an economic lesson. Professor just gave me his book. This afternoon, I just bought it. Gee whiz. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Double sale. Well, that was memorable, on point, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
It's
It
nice
was-
of you.
It was really very moving.
Should we hurry through this and get out before they start throwing things? What?
Yeah. We're going to have a little conversation, but I'm here primarily as a pointer, pointing to hands up in the audience, and we'll try to get you involved in the conversation because I know there's lots of questions.
I don't have to tell any of you how good he is at this. He's very, very good. I'm very nervous.
I was thinking when I was listening to the talk, in England during the war, during the Blitz, as you know, it was the lighter movies, the Hollywood extravaganzas, not the Mrs. Miniver was popular, but by and large, during the Blitz, they're watching different movies. They're not watching the Wake Islands and the Batons and things like that. What do you think? What do you think that is?
Absolutely. Well, it was escape. It was the same thing that happened, of course, during the Depression. You know, nobody wanted to see movies about the Depression. It was what they wanted to see was people singing and dancing, pretty ladies in pretty clothes, and men who put on tuxes. And very few movies really approached. My man Godfrey, maybe 5 or 10 others, actually approached the Depression head on. They just didn't do it. Not until much later, Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, I kept thinking of, my mother was saying, you know, going to some of these movies, she was, you know, my dad was in the 8th Air Force, she's at home, you know, with a baby and living with grandparents and things. And she said these were grim movies to watch. And, but when you talk to people in England, I talked to a lot of people in East Anglia, for example, they said, oh, we had organ music, triple features, you know, cartoons.
Yes. Well, that's quite true.
Stage performances, kind of rock, like Roxy used to do in the 20s.
Absolutely, and the numbers prove that. There were, as I suggested before, in 1942, 86 movies directly involving the war. Never again in 1943, 1944, 1945 did we have that many movies about the war at the time of the war. Had many, many more musicals. 30 to 40, 45% sometimes of the movies were musicals. Yeah. People wanted to see Carmen Miranda and watch that fruit salad hat. You know,
right?
That's what they were looking for. It's great stuff.
And another thing is we're not making a lot of movies about Germans.
No, not often. No, that's quite true. We didn't quite yet know the enormity of what was being wrought in Europe. We were being slapped in the face with what enormities were being wrought in the Pacific. We had many people to tell us. The Philippines were amazing about what the information they could get out to us about what was going on in the South Pacific.
That's why I thought your lecture was so point on, because the movies do become a reflection of popular culture. You made a beautiful connection between the films and national culture and music, you know, I mean, and exactly, you know, when servicemen signed up, you know, 87% of them want to go to fight Japan.
Absolutely. There was no question about that at that time. The thought was that the Axis, but particularly with reference to Germany, they thought of as a civilized opponent, one that dealt with a code that we had at least a general sense of what was going on. It wasn't until really after the war. We were told what was going on by some isolated but very complete stories that were told. There was a Time magazine story even before World War II about what was going on with Germany, but we didn't believe it. We thought it was propaganda. We didn't understand what was going on until Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton and Omar Bradley were touring the camps in 1945. We weren't convinced of the enormity of what was happening over there. Had that been made clear to us earlier, that might have made it entirely different.
I kept thinking too that people when they went to the movie, they saw a newsreel first.
Yes.
And they were looking for different things in a newsreel that they were looking for in a film. I mean, what they're looking for in a newsreel is the progress of the war.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we?
And we were always winning.
Exactly. We're always winning.
Yes.
What are they looking for emotionally in films?
What they were looking for was escape, don't you believe? I certainly do. It was pretty intense. That I remember very well. We were scared to death about our uncles. We weren't worried about Uncle Chick. That's the third uncle who I should have mentioned to you. He was very interesting. We didn't think he would ever be drafted because he had lost a finger to blood poisoning as a young boy and then lost an eye to meningitis. He was drafted anyway. There was a backstory on that. Chick, in spite of his problems, was a ladies' man. Ladies liked him a lot. He started dating the daughter of the mayor of Maysville, Kentucky. He dumped her, a bad strategic decision, because the mayor was also the head of the draft board in Mason County, Kentucky. Uncle Chick went on to become a recruiting sergeant in Cincinnati, Ohio. He had an office and suite at the Metropole Hotel in downtown Cincinnati. And after the war, when my two uncles came back, one from New Guinea and the other from Europe, the sky over Europe, they wanted to go to the western side of town and go to every bar in town and be feted and get drunk and get free drinks. But they made the mistake of taking Uncle Chick. Uncle Chick got there with them, and when they got to the bar, George would start to tell his story to the bartender, didn't care. And Uncle William would try to tell his story, the bartender didn't care. Uncle Chick would hold his hand up to his chin where his missing finger was. And he would say, yeah, war is pretty tough. You know? And then he would find a moment where he would take out his eye and put it on the bar. He said, you don't come back the same way you started, you know. Why, he was drunk for 2 weeks. Now, you match that for a war story, huh?
We're learning a lot in movies like this. Americans, as they're watching them, I'm trying to think what they're pulling from them. They're learning a lot, and they want to know a lot about the enemy.
Yes.
I mean, all the film clips you picked have something about the Japanese. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Especially Bataan, which is brutal. I mean, a crucifixion, a beheading,
you bet.
Unbelievable violence.
Terrible things that we had never really dreamed would happen. We knew there would be death, obviously.
I'm talking about the film. Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
Bataan was
the
unbelievable.
inevitability. What happened was when we, actually in Wake Island, as you recall, they did not have those graphic moments because we didn't know exactly what was happening yet. We knew about Nanking, but that was something else. We were Americans, after all. Nobody would treat us that way. That was not, we were signatories to the Geneva Convention. The Japanese, though they had signed it, had never ratified it. But that didn't seem important. We thought everybody would stand up to the Geneva Convention. And after the Wake Island story was told, it was only after that, and Wake Island itself had been already released as a film. Mm-hmm. Then we found out what was actually going on, and I know that there are many very young people here too. I have seen that, and when I'm talking about very young, that's anything under 55. Okay, children, yeah. But the thing that I would like to point out, people wonder what we felt like then. I, as a child, my uncles, there was apprehension and all of that. But the thing that we felt most of all was anger. There was a deep-set anger at what had happened to us. Mm-hmm. And we wanted that anger vented somehow. We wanted somehow to be avenged. And that was endemic in our responses. It now, when I talk to many friends that I have interviewed over the years who ask how we could have indeed dropped a nuclear bomb at the end of World War II. First of all, the entire anger message has to be made. And also, we thought we had been told, and one can argue the numbers, but we had been told there would be anything from a minimum of 50,000 deaths to as many as 500,000 deaths if we invaded the islands of Japan. And we based that on what had happened at Okinawa and the losses we suffered there and the way that the enemy had fought at that in that time. So it was very difficult for us as we lived there, as we were living through this. It wasn't just scrap iron drives, it wasn't just defense bonds, it wasn't any of that, it was winning the war. We wanted to win the war. We wanted retribution. That may not be a good thing to remember, but it is the truth. That is how we felt.
Bosley Crowther, the New York Times longtime book reviewer, went down to Quantico to watch Wake Island with 2,000 Marines. And there was a standing, as he says in his review, thunderous applause. Yes. Because, of course, at the end of the movie, the impression is given that everybody on Wake died.
Yes.
And they died firing. Mm-hmm. And you get this whole idea the Marines are coming. There's 140 million Americans behind this effort.
Yes.
You know, nothing is stopped here, the whole thing.
Yes, we believed that, and as we went further into the war, and we began to, there was North Africa, and then there was Italy,
yeah.
And then there was Ernie Pyle,
yeah,
and then there was and then there was of course the Fortress Europe, and all of that, and the planes over Fortress Europe. That began.
You know what really
this.
scared me? That watching it again, I thought I was trying to reach back and think what it would be like to watch the film as a 16-year-old.
Yes.
And Guadalcanal.
Very good point.
There's hokey parts in Guadalcanal, but there's a tremendous scene where William Bendix is in that bomb shelter.
Yes.
And this ain't the William Bendix that was on Wake Island wrestling around on the beach. No. And he basically says, I don't want to be here. I didn't ask to be here.
It's prayer. It was prayer.
It's prayer. It's prayer. And I'm scared.
Do you remember his prayer?
It's amazing. And so many of these films are just raw propaganda, but this one sends chills up your spine. Mm-hmm. These guys didn't want to be there, thought they might lose. The situation was grim. And when he finishes, all the chaplain says is, amen.
Amen. It's great.
Amen. That's an incredible scene for a World War II type of propaganda movie.
You bet it is.
Yeah.
If you get a chance, some of you won't want to see it again, but some of you might. It's well worth looking at it. The ones I've described to you here were all very successful motion pictures. Not all of the wartime movies were. Some of them were like Gung Ho, for instance, where it was very overtly propaganda.
Yeah. And
it's a little difficult to watch now. But some of the others are pretty darn good and evocative of the moment, of its moment. If so many of you were not there at that time, it's interesting because I would always check with my uncles whether this one was how it was. None of them were how it was, but was this close to how it felt? And he said, they would say, no, that's not close at all, but this scene is, or this person is, or I know that guy. Something like that. So those were always helpful to me.
And a great clip that you picked, a very reassuring moment. Doolittle on the phone, crisp, professional.
Yes.
Again, a guy in the film that would do anything that his troops would do, that his flyers would do.
Absolutely. And he was that guy.
Empathetic, but powerful. And do we have leaders like that? Yes.
Did we ever?
Yeah, that's
we did.
That's the reassuring thing in that one.
Still got them back here if they just stay away from my wife. Crying out loud. I'm going to get you out of town. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
That's great. I got to tell you, I know that you all have other things to do and other places to be, but I can't tell you what a pleasure it is, how much I've anticipated this, and what a pleasure it is for me to have an opportunity to see you face to face and to meet many of you, as I've been able to do in these last 2 days. It's been a remarkably rewarding time for me and for my family, who I obviously love a lot. And I'm very proud to have been here among all this hardware and all these great things. I used to see those in silhouettes. When I was 11 years old, I knew every airplane in the world. My uncles didn't. They were only flying them. What did they know? I knew the silhouettes of them all. That was my job.
Nick, do you have time for just a couple questions?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just, incidentally, you can ask me about anything. It doesn't have to be about this or anything else. I know some of you have an interest in some members of my family.
So we'll open it up.
That's right. If you have anything you'd like to ask, I will tell you the truth or a plausible lie.
We have roaming Phil Donahues throughout the audience here.
Back,
oh, my goodness.
Gentlemen, back to the right. Your right, my left.
Mr. Clooney, great talk. I just have a question. What, in your opinion, would be the best 3 or 4 or 5 war films that were made during the World War II era?
I think we've approached several of them. The ones done during the war, obviously, were limited by the things they could say and could talk about. But they sometimes sneaked in things that worked very well. Some just before the war, there was I certainly think Guadalcanal Diary is in that mix. I also think Wake Island is in that mix simply because of the director's job, that was John Farrow, his job of putting it together. The way he put it together, it was well integrated. And he took the information they got from the 11th of December communications back and forth between Hawaii and Wake Island itself, and really did talk about what actually happened when that battle was going on and when it actually drove off a substantial enemy force, sending it back. Now, think about that. Think about all of the times that we invaded islands. We had terrible times at them, but we were never driven off. From Tarawa, the place you could have been driven off from, if any, wouldn't you think? All of these, we were never driven off. That is why I think that Japanese historian who was talking to me made the point to me that this was a very difficult thing for the High Air Command to swallow. They had been driven back to the islands of Kwajalein to retool and come again 11 days later. That didn't happen to us. That's well worth remembering. All of these movies, when you look at them, think of them in context. What were we doing? What was the entire, our high command thinking? What was Nimitz thinking? And what was Bull Halsey thinking? What was going on at that time? And we, when you do that, the understanding of what the movie meant is I think much more enjoyable and much more educational for us. There are about I would say 5 movies that a group of just disinterested moviegoers now, about 5 that would be worth seeing, and I can list them for you, except that I'm old.
But would you put, Nick? Would you put films like documentaries that had kind of full feature elements in them, like Memphis Belle and Tarawa?
Absolutely.
The Marine Corps film of Tarawa, which won an Academy Award.
It certainly did, and of course John Ford's
and scared the hell out of everybody.
Oh yeah, and John Ford's Midway as well, which was late 1942,
and
early
San Pietro?
1943. Yeah, San Pietro was a terrific film. Those are good documentaries. I was thinking of feature films, what Hollywood was handing out, mostly hokum. But once in a while, they came up with some pretty good films.
Any questions?
Well, I'm glad.
There's one in the back.
Doggone,
right,
almost.
Right,
almost
dead center,
clean.
Gentlemen.
Yes, my favorite movie from World War II really is post-World War II, The Best Years of Our Lives, which Mr. Clooney is one of the chapters in your books, which I haven't read yet, but I have the book. I have 2 questions about that movie, because it really is post, I think it was made in 45 or 46.
It was started in 45, released in 46.
Released in 46. 2 things about the movie. The one actor who had the missing arm, who had the old-fashioned hook in his arm, I think he may have won an Academy Award as Best Supporting Actor. he was nominated. Whatever happened to him? That's one thing. The second question, then I'll sit down, would be, it's in your book, and you have some involvement with it, whether it's a high degree of respect or whatever. But to me, it's the most emotional, evocative section of what the war represents as the men came home and tried to get back to a normal lifestyle. So can you talk about the gentleman who with the hook, and also, if you will, because he had a hook in the movie, and he had a hook as a real person, my understanding of it was. And then your evaluation and why you have it in your book as one of your highlights and chapters of your book.
Sure, happy to. The film was released in 1946. It was actually begun before the war was over. It was the response to a story that had been told in Collier's magazine, and Sam Goldwyn was the one who decided to buy that and try to make a film out of it. And it dealt with the men who had already been coming back from the war and how they had changed and what had changed about the home front as well. What about the women they had left behind? He undertook that. That was a more adult theme than we had perhaps ever seen in a mainline motion picture from a major studio. Harold Russell was not an actor. He was a soldier. He lost both of his hands. He used to say in his speeches, he said, "I lost an argument with a block of TNT." And he was disarming a bomb. It went off, and he lost both of his hands. He did a training film for the Army, and the director, William Wyler, saw that and thought this would be the perfect person to fill out the third returning veteran. One of the returning veterans was Frederick March. He came back a drunk. He didn't know anything. He didn't know who his family was. He didn't know his son. He didn't know his daughter. He didn't get them at all, nor his wife. Then the other young man was played by Dana Andrews. He came back. His wife had been unfaithful to him for the whole time he was gone. They tried to patch the marriage back up. He was not fitting back into the civilian corps at all. It just wasn't working. None of them, you knew that Frederick March, when the movie was over, was going to still be battling alcoholism for the rest of his life. Dana Andrews, you knew that he was going to be battling efforts to get back into the civilian stream, and most importantly, you knew that while all of the others were going to go get another role, they were going to be cowboys or they're going to be Indians, but you also knew that Harold Russell would never be going back to have another role. This was his role. This is who he was going to be. Yeah. This emotional moment for me, it brings tears to my eyes every time I see it, is when he tries to tell his girlfriend what it was really going to be like. He took her up to his bedroom, and he took off the top of his pajamas, and he showed her the harness, and he showed what it would be like, what she would be required to do, how life was going to be from then on. And it was a remarkable scene, and it was, again, a really adult effort at telling us what this was all about. And that is exactly what happened, to your question, that's exactly what happened to Harold Russell. Harold Russell went home. He went back to his girlfriend from high school in New England. He married her. They had a wonderful life. Later in their life, he became a motivational speaker. He had a business. He was a business owner, an entrepreneur. She contracted cancer, very serious, and they ran out of money. He sold his Oscars, both of them, and he sold them for $50,000, and that was just enough to pay for the problems that his wife was having and not lose their own house. It is art imitating life, and it was a remarkable achievement for Sam Goldwyn, who never got anything right in his mouth. When he opened his mouth, everything came out upside down. Sam Goldwyn was the fellow who immortalized the phrase, "Include me out," followed by such several other phrases. And so he did them so poorly that when he went up to receive his Oscar, he finally got an Oscar for Best Picture of the Year for this movie. He got up, and there was a man named Hugo Friedhofer who got an Oscar for that movie for the music. But there was also a Hoagy Carmichael, the great pianist and composer, who was in the movie. And he got up there to congratulate his music master who had just gotten an Oscar. And he said, "I would like to congratulate Hugo Carmichael." Nobody knew who he was talking about. He never got anything right. He is a verbal agreement is not worth the paper it's written on, he said. Yeah. This was Sam Goldwyn, but he finally got his life's hope, which was to get a Best Motion Picture Oscar. And if you get a chance to see that movie, it's
when Frederick Marsh is coming in they're sitting in the nose cone of a B-17, and they're flying into a little Midwestern town, Cincinnati, and he said, "This is like hitting a beach. They're more scared of going home than they were of going into war, because they changed so dramatically, and the country's changed so dramatically." When we were doing this film, He Has Seen War, that's just out with HBO, Tom Hanks watched that segment 7 times, and he said, he had a great question. He said, why didn't they ever make a movie like that again? And nobody ever did, except maybe the Men, that Brando film in 50, about an amputee, who returns to the ward.
Teresa Wright was in that one too.
Yeah, and there were no more films like that. It was so real, so grim. People just wanted to push it back.
I think so, but it was really well done. How y'all doing? You hold together?
Another
Who's
question.
ready for a drink?
Jeremy?
Towards the back, in the right.
Mr. Clooney, I'm from Valparaiso, Indiana.
Get out.
And I had the pleasure in the late 70s of hiring a group to open a theater called Four Girls Four.
Yes, how about that? That was great.
Margaret Whiting, Rosemary Clooney, and who was the fourth one?
Well, it changed every now and then, but for the one, let's see, Valparaiso would have been what year?
Probably late 70s.
Okay, Nina, would that have been? There were 3 people.
I'll give you a hint.
Uh-huh.
She sang a song, Green Eyes.
Oh, it was Helen, of course. Helen O'Connell. She was in and out of the group often. Helen O'Connell was great. Was in that, and I was trying to remember who. Martha Ray was with them after Rosemary left. Rosemary was great. And Martha was a wonderful, wonderful lady. This going back to the war. She was so wonderful during World War II and during the Vietnam War and during the Korean War. She actually studied to become a nurse because she wanted to entertain the troops closest to the battle. And so she became a nurse so that she could go up there. And once she got there, she entertained. And boy, did she entertain. She was a girl after my own heart. She liked to drop them back a little bit, She when she was traveling with my sister Rosemary, they were in Hawaii. And just before then, several years before, it was in Vietnam, the days of Vietnam, and Martha was there as a nurse. The enemy began to send hand grenades and mortar fire into the encampment where they were. So they all dived. They were in the tents with the wooden floors, and they dived down. And one of the soldiers who jumped down on the wooden floor broke the finger in this hand. This broke a finger, and Martha, who was already lit to the gills, said, "Don't worry about a thing. I'm a nurse. I'll fix that." And she proceeded to do her version of setting his finger. 3 years later, there was always a group, they called her Captain Maggie, always a group of veterans, and they were in the side, and they would wait, and they'd say, hey, Captain Maggie, hey, Captain Maggie, and she'd sing a song to them, and it happened every place they went. But this one place, they were yelling, hey, Captain Maggie, and she said, yeah, I'll get to it. And there was one voice going, hey, Captain Maggie, hey, Captain Maggie. And he says, and she said, what do you want? He says, Captain Maggie, remember me? What a lady. That was great stuff.
Okay, one more question.
I don't want to bore people to death here.
Anyone else?
I see one.
Well, thank you all, and thank you.
And Don, I think there's one more,
Oh, there's
sir.
one more?
Excuse me.
Okay. It's hard to see with these spots.
Mr. Clooney, I...
Just Nick, please.
Nick, I saw a wonderful movie, and I was very young. I was 6 or 7 when the war started. No. Oh, I was 4, I'm sorry. But later on, I saw...
You were never a math major, obviously, right?
Yeah. But I saw this wonderful movie, and I can't recall whether it was made during the war or after. It was, and Robert Mitchum played a fantastic role in it, and I think it made his career. Was it made before? Can you remember the movie? It was in a battle.
Mm-hmm.
And
it could have been the story of G.I. Joe. He had a remarkable role in that, a small role, and many people think that it made his career.
I think it was G.I. Joe. Yeah.
It was G.I. Joe.
And he was, it was a great story, an Ernie Pyle story based on a column that Ernie had done. But Robert Mitchum's interesting. In the war, during the war, 1 year he did 32 roles. 1 year he had 32 small roles. He also was in the service briefly.
Nick, one other question. Usually interviewers ask questions they know the answer to. I don't know the answer to this. You were talking about literature before, and I'm thinking of a book, Philip Wiley, and he wrote a book called The Generation of Vipers.
Oh, yes.
And in that book, it's written in 1941. He argues that the generation we would later call the greatest generation was fully unprepared for this war. All they cared about was Frank Sinatra, chasing around Bobby Sox, girls, jukebox. They know nothing about geography. They can't find Japan on a map and that sort of thing. And it was a bestseller. Now, were there any movies that, not based on that book, but any movies that looked back to the 30s and said, isolationism was a mistake? I can't think of any.
No, nor can I. In other words, what you're trying to say is, was there ever any book that came up and said, wait a minute, we really got this wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's more incremental, don't you? I think that happens to us, and a step at a time. It's kind of difficult for us to stand up and say, boy, what a jerk I was. If I had said something in 1937, maybe none of this would have happened, or maybe less of it would have happened. Maybe it would have changed. I don't think we ever want to take that full responsibility for what perhaps we didn't do. But how we talk about our kids now? Well, they have no geography. They have no background. They don't know anything about us. They don't know anything about what we're doing here, except this young man right here. He's our apostle for the generation. So. We have that feeling about the kids today, I think. Many of us do. We certainly felt that way in 1940. Perhaps that would surprise some of our current. We had with some concern, because what was the percentage of young men who were rejected from service because they had no teeth, they had a very poor nutrition, didn't know how to write, couldn't do simple, rational studies. They couldn't do, and I'm talking about a very large percentage of the people who were being drafted were being rejected for not just physical reasons, but other reasons. And it took us a while to catch up. The GI Bill made a big difference.
Exactly.
After the war.
Exactly. Well, we're going to close this, and we're immensely grateful. This was powerful. It was witty. It was deeply knowledgeable. It was just so good, so entertaining.
We mustn't say goodbye.
Thanks a
We
lot.
mustn't say goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you.